Assalamualaikum sir, hari ini saya akan present tentang practical exercise bagi IPv4 and IPv6 static and default routes. Jadi kumpulan saya Muhammad Aiman Hakimi, Muhammad Fifi Sudir. Saya ni Muhammad Naufal, Zura DDT DBF 1005. Untuk pelogi kami, ni addressing table kami untuk IP address, untuk interface and prefix, device-device lah. Objektif kami part 1 untuk build the network and configure basic device settings. Part 2 configure and verify IP and IPv6 addressing on R1 and R2. Part 3 configure and verify static and default routing for IPv4 on R1 and R2. Part 4 configure and verify static and default routing for IPv6 and on R1 and R2. Ni backgroundnya. Static and default routing the simplest form of network routing and configure manually. They are fixed, meaning that they do not change dynamically to meet changing network conditions. They are either valid and made available to the routing table or invalid and not made available to the routing table. Static routes have an administrative distance of 1 by default. However, static and default routes can be configured with an administrator defined administrative distance. This capability allows the administrator to put all of the static or default route in reserve and only make it available to the routing table when routes with lower administrative distance, usually generated by dynamic routing protocols. No longer valid. In this practical exercise, you will configure static, default, and floating default routes for both IPv4 and IPv6, which may not reflect networking best practices. We also need to demonstrate the process of network building and the static default and floating default routes for both IPv4 and IPv6 configuration, along with explanation for each type. Ni required resource here to routers, to switches, one PC. Build the network and configure basic device settings. Step 1, cable the network as shown in topology. Test device ni lah. Semua cable as necessary. Step 2, configure basic setting for each router. Assign a device name to the router. Also disable DNS lookup to prevent the router from attempting to translate incorrectly into commands as though they were host names. Proceed, create a banner that wants anyone accessing the device that unauthorized access is prohibited. This is the running configuration to the startup configuration file.
Hi, my name is Mokrish Izzuddin Memon Zaib and my geometry is 17DDT22F 1073. And today I'm gonna be presenting part 1, build the network and configure basic device settings. So step 3, configure basic settings for each switch. A, assign a device name to the switch using command hostname S1 for switch 1 and hostname S2 for switch 2. B, disable DNS lookup to prevent the router from attempting to translate incorrectly entered command as though they were host names. So in this case, we're using command no IP domain lookup for switch 1 as well as switch 2. C, create a banner that wants everyone accessing the device that unauthorized access is prohibited. So we're using banner MOTD authorized users only on S1, same as S2. D, shut down all interfaces that will not be used. So on the S1 interface, range F0/1-3, F0/6-24 and G0/1-2, and then shut. On the S2, we're using the same interface. E, save the running configuration to the startup configuration file. On the S1 and S2, we're using copy running config and startup config. Part 2, configure and verify IPv4 and IPv6 addressing on R1 and R2. Step 1, configure IP addresses for both router. Enable IPv6 unicast routing on both router. So on the R1 and R2, we're using IPv6 unicast routing. B. Configure the IP address for all the interfaces according to the addressing table. So on the R1 interface G0/0/1, we enter the IP address that are on addressing table. As well as R2, we're using the interface G0/0/0 and also enter the IP address and IPv6 address from the addressing table. Step 2. Verify addressing. Issue the command to verify IPv4 assignments to the interfaces. So on the R1, show IP interface brief. On the R2 as well, show IP interface brief, and it will show the output. B. Issue the command to verify IPv6 assignments to the interfaces. So on the R1, we using show IPv6 interface brief. And for the R2 as well, show IPv6 interface brief, and it will come out the output. Step 3. Save your configuration. On the R1 and R2, we're using copy running config startup config.
Okay, sekarang kita sambung kat part C, iaitu configure and verify static for routing for IPv4 and router 1 and router 2. Okay. First, kita kena setkan dekat router 1 dia punya IP address dengan default gateway. Dekat bawah tu, dekat interface G00, kita setkan dia punya IP route juga. Okay, yang dekat 2, configure routing static default routes with AD of 18 via R2, lalu dekat G001 address. So IP routes ni kita setkan dekat G001 address. Begitu juga dekat router 2. So laluan dia lah. Kalau router 1 dia pergi kat G002, pergi kat R2. R2 dia nak pergi ke R1, dia lalu G000. Okay. So macam mana kita nak verify dia punya ni, kita kena tulis show IP routes dekat router 1. So kat sini kita boleh nampak ada IP address kat situ, 17, 12, 000, 16, ada yang dekat laluan 00 ni 206, 165. Lepas tu kat bawah ni via 172, 16, 2, satu yang kita set tadi, yang ni kat router 1. Okay. So so dekat router 1, issue the command trans routes 10.2.01. The output should show that next port is 192.168.12. Okay, kat sini kita dah setkan dia punya trace 0201 macam ikut soalan. Lepas tu kita setkan lagi satu, issue commands dia 209, set juga. So tracing the routes to 209. Lepas tu, lepas kita dah buat semua tu, dekat G000 kita kena shutdown kan dia dekat router 1. Lepas tu kita check pula show IP route static. Kita tengok kat situ ada IP address ke tak, subnet dia ada 2 mask. Okay. Lepas tu dekat R1, daemon floating static roads is working by issue trace 209.165.200 commons. The trace road will show the net hope as 192.168.12. Betul. Yang ni kita masukkan dia punya ni, and dia akan tunjuk kat sini 192.168.12. Macam ni. So lepas tu dekat G00 kita shutdown. No shutdown pula. Tadi kita shutdown, sekarang kita no shutdown dia pula. Lepas tu dekat router 2 kita setkan IPv6 dia pula yang telah diberikan dalam soalan. So seperti yang kita tengok ni lah dia punya IPv6 dia. Lepas tu use the ping command ensure that R1 G00 interface is readjustable. Configure a static default routes via G00 address. So yang ini kita masukkan dia punya IP lah. Okay. Step 3 pula on router 2 configure floating static default routes via R1. So kat sini kita masukkan IP address yang menuju ke R1 tu lah, IPv6 punya, sama macam IPv4 tadi. Okay, yang ni pun sama, R1 to R1 G00, masukkan dia punya IP. Lepas tu kita boleh tengok kat sini, kalau kita tulis kat R2 tulis show IPv6 roads, dia akan keluar lah dekat sini. Saya zoom sikit. Tak boleh zoom, tak apa. Okay, kat sini dia ada IP address dia. Okay. Part 4, configure and verify static and default routing for IPv6 on R1 and R2. Okay, kita kena masukkan dia punya trace route untuk router 2. So kat sini kita type macam ni, and dekat bawah dia akan keluarkan balik dan berapa MSEC yang kita dapat 13 kalau kita tengok kat sini. So kat bawah pun kita buat benda yang sama, cuma kita tukar dia punya IP. Kat sini kita dapat kosong lah dia punya ni. Yang kedua, issue the shutdown commands dekat G00. So kat sini kita kena shutdown kan dekat laluan G000. So kita kena shutdown. So kat sini bila kita tulis show IPv6 route static, so dia akan keluar lah kat sini. Okay, itu je daripada kami. Assalamualaikum dan selamat sejahtera.